This is such an amazing event. And we're just delighted that Sharon Leider is here with her wonderful family. And we are all going to have a very exciting and passionate speaker today, Dr. Alison Holman, who is going to be talking about compassion. And as we know, during this pandemic that we've been in for such a long time, compassion is the only thing that's getting people through. As Dr. Holman just mentioned to us a little while ago, almost 600,000 people have been impacted by this, have died because of COVID. And so this learning about compassion to a much greater degree than what we already know is so important. I want to thank Sharon Leider for being such a wonderful family member to the School of Nursing. Sharon has gone above and beyond in terms of allowing us to collaborate with her in terms of hosting this very special event for Suzanne Renee Leider. And also Sharon has just been just wonderful in terms of her generosity to the school and being a member of the leadership circle. So we're just delighted, Sharon, that you are part of our family. And I'd like to open the floor to you now to say a few words.
Thank you, Dean Mammoth. And hello to all of the undergraduate and advanced practice nursing students, School of Nursing faculty, and community and family members in our virtual audience. Thank you for taking time from your busy lives to attend today's lecture as we honor our wonderful nurses and share in their hopes and aspirations. Our daughter Suzanne is the inspiration of the endowment we created in today's lecture. I cannot think of a more appropriate way to honor her life and to continue her legacy of compassionate care. Suzanne was 25 years old, deep into her nursing career and looking forward to continuing her education when she noticed a lump in her thigh. Thinking she had pulled a muscle while running, she had had it looked after, and after much time and many tests, and given less than a year to live. Despite the diagnosis, Suzanne lived. During that time, my family and I had the honor of watching nursing professionalism up close and personal. 11 surgeries, countless chemotherapy infusions, radiation procedures over 10 years, we witnessed and were the beneficiaries of the loving compassion that sustained and enriched our lives as we lived our nightmare. We have a deep and abiding love and gratitude to those on her medical team who made our journey bearable. My family and I are profoundly indebted to Dr. Alison Holman, who is the living example of all that Suzanne advocated. Her health and dedication to our mission has brought us to this day. This wonderful woman has found time in her incredibly busy schedule to honor Suzanne's memory. It is certain they would have been great friends to a quest for patient-centered, compassionate care. We are blessed to have Alison's friendship, and we look forward to growing our endowment to help support more of our students who will benefit from her guidance and wisdom. Thank you all for joining us, courageous warriors, and supporting their mission. I would like to now turn the program back to the Dean.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for those lovely words and reminding us about the story of Suzanne Renee Leider. Thank you for that. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Alison Holman. Alison is a full professor in our School of Nursing, and she's also a professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences at the School of Social Ecology. So she's so well steeped in this area of mental health and psychology and compassion, which she's going to be talking about. Her area of research is quite exciting. She's been looking at the biological, psychological, and social predictors of long-term outcome, mental health, physical health of individuals who've been exposed to trauma. And if there's a hurricane out there, Alison is right behind it. She has been doing research, securing funding within rapid speed, and looking at crisis or critical situations such as the 9/11 terrorist bombing, the Boston Marathon bombing, and Orlando nightclub shooting, and a number of different hurricanes, because there is so much that we need to learn about how people's health is impacted by the trauma that they experience and the crisis. Dr. Holman's funding has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the National Institute on Nursing Research, Josiah Macy Foundation, and many other areas. And her topic that she's going to cover today is all about COVID-19. Dr. Holman, thank you so much.
Thank you, Addie, for that lovely introduction. So today I want to start by saying thank you to the Leider family, because the Leider family has had such a deep commitment to supporting the education of our nurses in our school. And it's been many, many years. It started back when one of our audience members, Ellen Olshansky, was our director. And the Leiders have continued on a regular basis supporting and promoting compassionate care. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being such great leaders and role models for us. I also want to, and so it's definitely a close bond that we have with the Leider family. And when I was interim director, I remember working very closely around this lecture. And it's been a wonderful experience for me to get to know the family. And I just want to say thank you again. Excuse me. I'd like to start by saying a couple things about Suzanne Renee Leider. Suzanne, as a young person, was very clear on her that her calling was nursing. Despite being encouraged by others to attend medical school, she pursued a Bachelor of Science degree in nursing at the University of San Francisco. Upon graduating in 1991, Suzanne began her nursing career at the Veterans Administration Medical Center in San Francisco, ultimately making her way to the UCSF, University of California, San Francisco Medical Center kidney transplant unit. In late 1992, Suzanne was diagnosed with synovial cell sarcoma, undergoing surgery and radiation to treat the condition. When the sarcoma returned several years later, she chose to continue nursing while undergoing her treatment. She also began to teach at UCSF. When nursing was no longer physically possible for her, Suzanne focused on the teaching. She also pursued graduate studies with the dream of earning a doctorate in nursing. Suzanne was loved by patients, students, doctors, and fellow nurses. So this lecture is in her honor. This is to say thank you to Suzanne Leider. So I would like now to announce our recipient of the Suzanne Renee Leider Award. I want to say congratulations to Mr. Taylor Cohen, a third-year BSN student, and the 2021 Scholarship Award recipient of the Suzanne Renee Leider Nursing Endowment. Congratulations, Taylor. He is being honored today for his commitment to compassionate care. After serving in the Marine Corps, he was certain he wanted a career in nursing because he knew that it would be extremely meaningful and important work. He's right. Very meaningful, very important, and hats off to you, Taylor. Taylor shares, and these are his words, "My educational journey has been very challenging, to say the least. However, it has also been very rewarding. I enjoy the clinical rotations the most because I have the opportunity to practice all of the nursing skills I have learned and experience different fields within nursing. Right now, I hope to work as an ICU nurse, but I am keeping an open mind as I progress through the rest of my clinical rotations." So thank you, Taylor, for those wonderful words and for your commitment to providing compassionate care to underserved populations. We're very proud of you. So I think at this point I go into my talk, is that correct? I think that's the next step. Okay, so everybody can send wonderful kudos to Taylor for his work. And I will now share my screen and get us started. Okay, are we good? Can everybody see this? Yeah, okay. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with you my reflections on compassionate care for healing from the cascading collective crises and traumas that we have experienced over the past year. However, before I start my talk, I would like to have a moment of silence to honor the memory of the 593,289 Americans who have died of COVID in the past year, and their families and loved ones. Thank you. Okay, so let's start. I started my career in the pediatric ICU, witnessing trauma and its impact on the mental and physical health of many children and their families. Since then, I've been studying trauma, and especially collective trauma, for the past 3 decades. Yet I have never seen anything like what we have been going through for the past year. 2020 was uniquely characterized by a series of cascading collective traumas that profoundly changed our daily lives. The coronavirus, an economic recession, climate-driven natural disasters, and a societal reckoning about racial trauma in this country have all impacted us. Individually, each of these events represents a major collective stressor, but taken together, they are unlike anything we have seen since 9/11, and in 2020, we had to cope with all of them happening at the same time. And at the core of all this we had the most unique collective stressor of my lifetime, certainly. Unique because it was an invisible threat. We didn't know who was infected. It was an ambiguous threat. We didn't have any idea how bad it was going to get. It created for us a very uncertain future because we didn't know how long it was going to last. And it was a global threat, and no community was safe from COVID-19. It also forced us to change our fundamental way of relating to each other at a time when we needed each other to help us cope. It took away our usual sources of distraction and disrupted all aspects of our lives. And the pandemic touched every aspect of our lives and ushered in profound loss of life, life's plans, and our sense of normalcy. 2020 also served as a banner year for demonstrating to us how much our life experiences can shape our experience of time. The pandemic left many people feeling as though they were running into a brick wall that stopped our movement through time in its tracks. Indeed, the impact on our sense of time was so pervasive that at least one TV station started a segment called "What Day Is It?" These distortions in how we experience time have been linked in my prior research with persistent psychological distress in the years following the Southern California wildfires of 1993 and the September 11th terrorist attacks. But as time dragged on, many of us found ourselves languishing, feeling joyless, unmotivated, unable to focus, and without purpose, all at a time when we were nationally coping with immense grief and loss of our normal lives. Then we had the myth of COVID being an equalizer. But the truth on the ground is anything but that. Cases and deaths of Black, Indigenous, and Latinx Americans have substantially outpaced their proportion in the population. In many parts of the country, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous Americans were dying at 2 to 4 times the rate of white Americans. For Indigenous communities, COVID has dealt an especially hard blow to the preservation of languages, as many elders who teach language to their children have died. To understand how Americans are coping with this very difficult year, my colleagues and I started a study. We collected data from the NORC AmeriSpeak panel, a probability-based representative sample of Americans. By using this panel, we were able to collect data on more than 6,500 Americans who had previously provided data on their mental and physical health. So we know what their health status was prior to the pandemic, which is a very important feature of our research because it allows us to look at how health changes over time after the pandemic. In mid-March, we randomly assigned a random sample of the AmeriSpeak panelists into 3 10-day consecutive cohorts spanning from March 18th through April 18th, 2020. We asked them about their worries, loneliness, symptoms of stress and depression, and more. As expected, we found that across the 3 consecutive cohorts, so this means between March 18th and April 18th in 3 different cohorts, we saw that acute stress and depressive symptoms were steadily increasing. In late September, we did a follow-up of the same respondents to look at how they were faring over time. We found that while people appeared less worried, they also reported more depression and loneliness 6 months into the pandemic. We also found that both the increase in loneliness and our distorted sense of time were associated with more worry, stress, and depression in the fall. We then looked at the psychological responses for healthcare workers, other essential workers, and the general population, and found that early in the pandemic, healthcare workers reported less stress and acute stress than other essential workers and the general population. At wave 2, we found the same pattern. Healthcare workers were consistently reporting fewer symptoms of worry, distress, and post-traumatic stress, with significant differences noted in global distress and post-traumatic stress. Healthcare workers also tended to report fewer symptoms of emotional exhaustion at wave 2 and fewer perceived benefits, although these differences were not significantly different from the other groups. When we took a closer look, though, at the perceived benefits being reported by the healthcare workers, we saw that workers reported benefits of feeling more grateful. They were recognizing their own personal strengths more, and they were adjusting their priorities to cope with COVID. However, I have to note that these findings are limited to a small sample of 169 healthcare workers, and we don't know how many of them were actually nurses. So we cannot use them to ascertain how nurses are doing as they cope with the pandemic. In fact, our findings were quite different from the stories that I was reading in the news. So I sought to find out more about the well-being of nurses during the pandemic. What I found was quite concerning. Kaiser Health News Service recently reported about the trauma and grief being suffered by the healthcare workers in this country. They point out that over 3,600 healthcare workers have died in the pandemic, and that 2/3 were people of color. More than half were younger than 60 years old. And this sad news comes at a time when our profession is working hard to diversify its ranks. Of those who died, nurses and support staff were most likely to die. And a lack of PPE and COVID testing and poor contact tracing were all contributing to these death rates. And then I read this piece by Teresa Brown, a renowned nurse writer, and who was one of our previous Leider lecture speakers. She wrote this article to describe the experiences of nurses during the pandemic, the stressors they faced, the impact the pandemic was having on them, and on the well-being, emotional well-being of our profession. What she describes should give us all pause. Pulling data from surveys of many thousands of nurses nationwide, we have seen burnout rise from 25% in April 2020 to 60% in December 2020. I want to make a point here, which is that the samples that they're using for these studies are convenience samples, so people volunteer to join these polls. So it's possible that the responses they're getting are from people who are the most distressed. To do this work, to get a really good sense of what's going on in the profession, I would argue that we would need a representative sample of nurses to be able to really know for sure what the status is. But that said, it is a little bit concerning that the rates were going up so high in the people who were responding, and there were many thousands of respondents in those samples. That burnout is leading some to quit the profession. But equally concerning is the depersonalization that is part of burnout. Depersonalization renders people emotionally numb, unable to experience empathy, and that is a serious threat to the provision of compassionate nursing care. If nurses become numb to the emotional needs, experiences of their own emotional experiences and those of others, that would create a compassion crisis in healthcare. This obviously wouldn't happen to all nurses, I know that. And I don't even think it would happen to most nurses. However, the fact that burnout, and hence this depersonalization, is increasing among nurses is a red flag that we should all heed. With 20% of the nurses leaving the profession due to burnout and many nurses ready to retire, that we are left with the question, can we close the gap? Can we educate and train enough nurses to fill the gap that we're seeing already? And how will the pandemic affect our ability to fill that gap? These are really important questions facing the nursing profession. The good news on this is that applications to nursing schools are on the rise. The downside is that it's much more difficult to educate many, many nurses because we need clinical placements for them so that we can actually put them somewhere to train them. Sorry. Anyway, given the dangers that nurses have faced during the pandemic, which go far beyond the virus, closing the gap could be a challenge. Nurses reported inadequate supplies of PPE, leading to reuse or using one's own PPE. Only 43% said they had enough PPE during the pandemic. Indeed, PPE was in such short supply that some nurses resorted to wearing garbage bags for protection. And that's a real sad state of affairs for nursing, for healthcare. On top of that, 78% of nurses said there was a shortage of nurses. Nurses were working extra shifts in extremely dangerous settings, like COVID ICUs, with some nurses reporting that they were assigned to take care of 4 patients at a time. Now, I don't know how many of you know this, but an ICU nurse is not supposed to take care of 4 patients. That's what people take on the floors. ICU nurses are supposed to have 1 to 2 patients at the most. And asking nurses to care for 4 ICU patients at a time is both unsafe and unethical. Yet this wasn't uncommon during the pandemic. And then there is the grief, the seemingly endless stream of people getting sick and dying from COVID. Some nurses reported 10, 12 patients dying per shift, per 12-hour shift. How are nurses supposed to cope with that? We're trained to help people, to save their lives. And that much death, that much grief could become a daily purveyor of profound guilt and shame. I strongly encourage all of you to watch this video, Death Through the Nurse's Eyes, so you can see what the nurses are dealing with. It may inspire you, I hope it inspires you, to take compassionate action in your community to support our nurses. So all of these experiences can lead to moral injury. Moral injury is not a mental illness. It is a feeling of betrayal by the administration of a hospital or by a community that can engender feelings of shame, guilt, and disgust. It comes from some nurses saying they feel like a human torture device because they had to do things to people to try to save them that didn't help them. It comes from being short-staffed, having inadequate PPE, from being exposed to overwhelming death. It comes when one feels the administration doesn't care if you, as one nurse said, live or die. In essence, moral injury will take place where compassion is lacking. All right, so what can we do about this? How do we respond to the overwhelming trauma of 2020 as health professionals caring for our patients, caring for ourselves? What does it mean to be compassionate in the face of such trauma? Well, to respond compassionately to our patients, we first need to understand the cultural context that helps shape both the trauma and our responses to it. Deep-seated cultural mores canonized in Horatio Alger's stories of poor boys becoming self-made men can have a profound impact on both our experience of and response to trauma. The message of his stories promoted a deeply individualistic narrative about what we should expect from people who are coping with adversity. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. The problem is with this approach that not everyone has boots. This narrative is one of the core themes that has shaped how we interpret people's behaviors as they cope with trauma. For example, we often expect people to get over their experience within a relatively short period of time and move on. If they don't, we pathologize their response instead of thinking it was a normal response to a profoundly abnormal experience. But psychological research offers us an alternative way to frame what it means to cope with trauma. And it offers us a new path for approaching each other and our patients with compassion. It starts with the core understanding that human beings have a fundamental need to belong. As Baumeister and Leary wrote in 1995, human beings are fundamentally and pervasively motivated by a need to belong. That is, by a strong desire to form and maintain enduring interpersonal attachments. People seek frequent, active, affectively positive interactions within the context of long-term caring relationships. Experiencing major adversity, especially when it's caused by human behavior, can leave people feeling alone, disconnected, afraid to trust, and sometimes on the margins of society. And this is why compassion is so necessary for healing from trauma. Compassion is the glue that connects and reconnects us, that fulfills our need to belong. Compassion is contagious. We sense it in others, and when we do, we are more likely to behave altruistically. Importantly, our actions may trigger a butterfly effect, where one person can behave in a compassionate way towards somebody, and then that person can spread it to someone else, and then it becomes contagious. And pretty soon, all those small actions affect an entire community. Given this, how can we best show compassion for our patients who are coping with trauma? Trauma-informed care is a holistic approach to working with traumatized patients that recognizes the powerful role trauma has in shaping our lives, our behaviors, our worldviews. It asserts that helping survivors heal involves creating safe spaces, being trustworthy and transparent, offering support that empowers people, placing the event in that broader context, and more. It considers the multi-generational and historical forms of trauma that have affected people. It looks for the human need behind challenging dysfunctional behavior. And most importantly, it situates current behavior in the lived experience of the person, not his or her character. But trauma-informed care has limitations. The focus is on the individual, which is needed, but trauma can emerge from collective experiences as well. violent neighborhoods, community disasters, systemic discrimination against specific racial or ethnic groups are all collective experiences of trauma to some degree. So if treatment is focused entirely on helping the individual, it may leave the systemic causes of trauma in place, so people remain at risk once they leave your care. Trauma-informed care also focuses on trauma's impact, but not so much on the growth and the thriving that some people can experience, that many people experience in the aftermath of trauma. Healing-centered engagement offers a slightly different path forward, or I should say actually not different, but actually a very, they work together. It's a good combination with trauma-informed care. So healing-centered engagement is a strengths-based approach to caring for traumatized nurses and patients. It's collectively oriented, and it's focused on the principle that healing transforms people and people transform communities. It places culture at the center of well-being. It views healing from trauma as being rooted in transforming the causes of harm in institutions to minimize the risk of re-exposure. And it engages us in service to others as part of our healing from trauma exposure. This approach casts compassion as being intimately tied to social justice, to making our social institutions more responsive to the needs of all people. So what might this look like in 2021 as we are coping with the challenges facing our profession? I believe we need to actively cultivate through our own behaviors, a sense of social responsibility. No one lives in a social vacuum. We all depend on each other, and we are each part of a very powerful social fabric that holds us all up. Helping each other gives us purpose and meaning in life that supports our mental and physical health. We need to heal from the moral injury by engaging in community support to honor nurses. Having National Nurses Month, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but National Nurses Week has been turned into National Nurses Month. So having National Nurses Month is one small step in this direction to set the stage nationally. But we also need to make institutional changes to address the racism in healthcare, to address inadequate staffing and support the mental health of nurses. Toward that end, and in the spirit of healing-centered engagement, nurses who are ready to leave the profession could help themselves heal by engaging in political action as advocates for our profession, to help in their action in their communities, to help make meaningful change that will benefit the profession. If you don't want to be a bedside nurse anymore, you don't want to work in an ICU, you can become politically active, run for office, do stuff in your community to make sure that you're supporting fellow nurses and doing something to fix the problems that drove you away from patient care. A growing body of research on flourishing from Harvard's Human Flourishing Program has shown that taking action to fix the root causes of trauma, of the trauma that nurses have experienced, could foster a sense of purpose and give new meaning to our lives. It would be a great service to the profession, and it would help promote the healing. As individuals, there are several steps that we can take to move ourselves from languishing to flourishing. One of the most important is to get involved in something meaningful, to stop multitasking and give ourselves uninterrupted time so you can focus on something meaningful and experience the flow of being engaged. We can also set small goals for ourselves that we can achieve and then reward ourselves when we achieve them. This helps us rebuild a sense of future at a time when COVID rendered our sense of future, a little bit like uncertain. You can also savor and celebrate the small things in life. Create weekly gratitude ritual. Do 5 good deeds in one day. and look for connections in community and try something new that you haven't done before. All of these are suggestions that have been made by the researchers from the Harvard Flourishing Institute. And I would recommend that you think about, if you feel like you are languishing, I'd recommend that you think about engaging in some of these kinds of behaviors to help yourself. So, but I would suggest, and I would argue to you that by helping ourselves flourish, moving ourselves toward flourishing, we are also going to grow our ability to be compassionate. However, we also need to do something more. I believe that we need to commit to cultivating compassion throughout our lives. That is, compassion is a lifelong calling, to be humble, to be open, to be conscientious in all areas of our lives, from our relationship with ourselves to our behavior in civil society. And to do that, we must look in the mirror and reflect on our own attitudes, beliefs, biases, and behaviors, our behaviors toward other people that prevent us from truly seeing who they are and what they are dealing with in life. For example, I know a young man who had refused to take a COVID vaccine. And my first thought about him was he's being selfish and uncaring. When I asked more questions about why he was feeling that way, I found out that he was scared that something bad would happen to him, that would leave him out of the picture, that would leave his baby without a loving father. He has an almost 2-year-old baby. And he was afraid that he would leave his baby without a loving father, which was an experience he had as a child. An experience, and his fear was not rational. It was driven by the pain he had experienced growing up. This awareness gave me the opportunity to respond to him with compassion and help him address his concerns about the safety of the vaccine. And he finally got one. Yay. So we are all subject to making these kinds of false assumptions, these rash judgments about other people based on our worldviews or explicit and implicit biases. And these assumptions and judgments may lead us to misunderstand people or even seriously harm another person. We see this happen regularly with unarmed Black men, women, boys, and girls, where inaccurate race-based assumptions about their intent has resulted in deadly violence being perpetrated against them. Or inaccurate assumptions about the character of a rape survivor that colors society's view of them and leads to blaming the victim for their assault. So I would suggest to you that compassion asks us to wrestle with our conscience, also known as our inner voices, to take responsibility for our actions, to challenge negative stereotypes we may have, the core assumptions we may have, the things that we think about other people who don't act or look like us, as I had to do with the young man who was concerned about getting the vaccine. What I am saying is we need to catch ourselves. We need to catch ourselves making these rapid assumptions about people that may impugn their character and try to reframe our thinking to give them the benefit of the doubt. After all, isn't that what you would want someone to do for you if you were behaving unusually? By doing this, we commit ourselves to a path that transcends American individualism and uses the glue of compassion to strengthen the intrinsic social bonds that connect us despite any racial, ethnic, class, sexual, or other differences that we may have. What I have come to understand from my work as a researcher, a clinician, and an educator is that we all, and I mean all of us, have a unique story, a life that animates us. That story now includes coping with and surviving the cascading collective traumas of 2020. Truly compassionate care seeks to understand those stories, our truths, and calls us to really see each other, accept each other, and advocate for each other when we encounter situations and institutions that perpetuate the trauma that harms us. To do this, we must be willing to challenge ourselves to see beyond the stereotypes, to the biases, the preconceived notions or assumptions we might use to define each other, and instead create a safe place where we can all be ourselves, a place where we all belong. It is my hope that by actively engaging in this way, we can cultivate compassion from the inside out. And in so doing, we can serve as agents for creating a kinder, more just, and healthier society. Toward that end, the nursing profession urgently needs you as partners in healing from the trauma of 2020. We can help each other heal. We need people in the community to support us by getting vaccinated to stop the spread of the virus and its variants. We need compassionate community leaders to step up and serve as role models for change. People to help us find creative approaches that address the root causes of trauma that nurses are facing, that all of us are facing. We need you to work with the nurses in your communities, to get your communities to provide resources for mental health services, nurses, and other healthcare providers who are coping with the grief and moral injury that they have experienced over the past year. And finally, we need each of you to realize that compassion, and I'm saying this is a term from a dear friend who may recognize it as I say it, but compassion is serious, lifelong business that is worth every second that we devote to it. Please step up as leaders to promote compassion in your communities, and by doing everything that you can to make them a safe place where everyone can belong. You can help us in this process, and I strongly encourage you to visit the American Nurses Association website, as it offers weekly activities during National Nurses Month, this month, May 2021, to support the nursing profession. Note that the very last week, week 4, is about community engagement, an essential part of the healing-centered engagement that I'm advocating we use to support our profession. So I encourage you to go to the American Nurses Association website, and please be the butterfly that helps spread compassionate action throughout your community. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Holman. This is Juliana Goswick. I'm the Director of Development with the School of Nursing. And we want to take this moment to invite everyone here who has a question to put it in the chat box. And we're going to take a little bit of time and talk with Dr. Holman. And, you know, I can't think of a better way to honor the memory of Suzanne Renee Leider, as well as ushering in Nurses Month. Thank you for that announcement, Dr. Holman, with your beautiful words and important research. You mentioned earlier, moral injury happens when compassion is lacking. And I'm just wondering, as our audience starts to put their questions in the chat box, can you talk a little bit about the importance of leadership at a local, state, and national level? And compassion, the role compassion plays in decision-making.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why I said we all need to take time to look in the mirror and reflect, is because sometimes we may not realize that the way we're behaving with other people is actually lacking in empathy and compassion. And so in terms of leadership, I think being leaders means being able to stop and reflect on what is driving me to make this decision that I'm making. So for hospital leaders, for people in leadership roles in hospitals or clinics or any healthcare setting, to reflect and think about, well, what is the motive behind, or what are the thoughts or the potential biases or assumptions that are behind my thinking and my decision making in this situation, and identifying those and being able to say, is that something I want to do? Is that actually going to be beneficial for this organization? And if it might not, and I can tell you, there've been studies that have shown that when you treat people really well in a work environment, what you find is better productivity. You find better morale. You find people who are able to do the job they are tasked to do with much more, getting much more of a sense of meaning from it. And therefore you're encouraging a healthier work environment. So I would argue that in terms of at the institutional level, as well as beyond in state legislatures could help pass laws that require, that actually have teeth in them to make sure that we protect nurses. When nurses need to have a 4-to-1 ratio on a floor, or a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2 ratio in an ICU, we need people to take action to actually make that happen. And those are the kinds of leadership that we need to see. And that could be done in a hospital, it can be done in a clinic, it could be done in a legislature, it could be done nationally. But those are the kinds of things, getting involved and doing all those things. I hope that was an answer to your question.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Holman. Lots of questions coming in.
If I
From
might
Jessica.
interject for a
Can I just
second.
Can I just say one quick thing also? I put up this next slide because I want to acknowledge all of my colleagues in this research, because I have wonderful colleagues who I have been fortunate enough to work with for the past, well, some of them more than 30, almost 30 years, more than 30 years actually. So I just want to say thank you to my colleagues and just recognize all my colleagues. Their names are here, and I just want to say that. Sorry.
Alison, if I can just thank you personally for this wonderful presentation. I know it's touched everyone's hearts, and I think this topic is so endearing because every one of us, as you say, can make a difference. And besides that, you had wonderful data to share, and that I think data speaks of power as well. I just wanted to personally ask you before Juliana goes through additional questions. How do you deal with the trauma of seeing other people's experiences to life crises? You know, how do you get through it? Because that's got to be very traumatic just to observe as well.
It's a very interesting question, Addie. So I am no longer engaged in patient care. So I don't do the face-to-face engagement with patient care. And in my research, I do most of my research is done through online panels, through representative panels of Americans, which help me understand and make statements about to generalize beyond. But I have personally had to cope with many of my own events and people in my life, those of the people in my life, and coping with that is hard. Sometimes it means crying. Sometimes it means, you know, I try to do what I can as an individual to take care of myself. As my colleague Roxy knows, and she knows I insist on exercising on a regular basis. I try to eat well. I try to take care of my body and my mind. I thank my mother for that. She was an avid nutrition freak. But I am very appreciative of doing those small things for myself that take care of myself. But as I said, you know, sometimes it requires being really letting myself experience. I think one of the things that I want to share is that, you know, for the darkest periods in my own life, I can say that one of the hardest things I did was to face the discomfort, the pain of the darkness. But I did that in the context of having social connections. I did that in the context of having people in my life who were loving me and caring for me and helping me. So, and I actively sought those out. There are people who have a hard time seeking out those connections. And so it really behooves us to try to reach out to people who may be suffering and offer them that support. And I should say that to the extent that we engage in pro-social behavior to help others, we're actually helping ourselves. It is a selfish endeavor as well, because it actually is good for our mental and physical health, ultimately.
Thank you.
I hope I answered your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Holman. Yeah, I wanted to mention over 150 people registered for this lecture today. And it's just astounding. It speaks to the importance of your research. There's 104 participating today and lots of questions coming in. Dr. Holman, this one comes from Jessica. Says, hello, Dr. Holman. Thank you so much for your inspiring presentation. What are some of the ways to involve the community to show safely more compassion during the pandemic?
Oh, that's a really good question. So being involved in the community could mean something as simple as, for those of you who attend church or synagogue or mosque, or other places of worship, it could mean going to those places and engaging with the people in your churches, in your religious homes. It could also mean being engaged and going to finding out what's going on in your city council. What's your city council allocating resources for? Are they allocating resources to support the people in the community who need it the most? For example, one of the things that I believe is sorely needed to help us right now, because the vaccine rates are dropping down. One of the things we absolutely need to do, because vaccine rates in communities of color are nowhere near what they are in communities predominantly inhabited by white people. And so one of the things we need to do is, advocate for the city councils to get some mobile vans, and we'll bring some nurses in. The nurses can take the mobile vans and go to the communities that need the vaccine, but they may not have transportation. They may not have the internet. They may not have the resources that they need to actually know how and where to go to get a vaccine. So take it to them. Get in the vans and go out into the community and drive into the community and go door to door. Offer people vaccines. That's one way to help get people. And then you can talk to them and you can help walk them through some of their fears. That might be a way to help people get through some of their fears. And if they don't want it, they don't want it, but you can at least offer it to people. So those are some of the things that I could see people doing in the community. Just a couple examples. I mean, I could probably come up with more, but I'll let you ask questions.
This is from Dr. Ira Lott in our audience. He says, I think Suzanne Leider would have been empathetic to your presentation as she battled the challenges of her own illness against her passion for nursing. From Kiko, Kiko is asking, what can we say to people that are really afraid of taking the COVID vaccine?
It's an excellent question. And it's actually one that I would say less talking and more listening. So I would say if somebody is expressing to you concerns or fears about taking the vaccine, explore with them why. Find out why they're concerned. What are your concerns? And if you can, share with them what your understanding is of the safety of the vaccines, and perhaps even the comparison between the very known and very serious danger that they face against when dealing with COVID itself, or being having potentially being put in an ICU and perhaps dying. Those experiences are real. As I said at the very beginning, 593,289 people in America have died. This is a very serious pandemic. So helping them see that the risk from the disease is far more deadly than the potential risk of a vaccine. We can look at the data, but first, instead of going to them and preaching at them, it's really important to hear, to listen. What are your concerns? Why do you feel that way? Help me understand where you're coming from. And in doing that, we can then help walk with them to the process of maybe considering getting a vaccine. And it may take time. It's not, those kinds of things don't happen overnight all the time.
Next question comes from Ruth. There are over 5 million people in the US with intellectual disabilities. As you reach out to other communities, what role do you visualize? I would imagine she's referring to the nurse.
For the nurse to reach out to
For the
people
nurse.
with intellectual disabilities, it was?
I believe so. Ruth, I don't know if you want to clarify your comment. It says, as you reach out to other communities, what role do you visualize for the, and it stops there. I would imagine she's referring back to the role of the nurse.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Okay, I think that is where it would be really important, in my view, for nurses to work with people who have been trained very carefully in working with people with intellectual disabilities, and working to help approach. And I don't know if that's with regard to helping them get the vaccine specifically, but if so, then I would say we need to work with them carefully, very closely, and be very respectful of their concerns, but at the same time, try to help them understand the risks, and using materials that are appropriate for their level of understanding would be necessary in such a case. So nurses could work closely with people who have perhaps a better understanding or a better connection with that population to help guide them and educate them toward the possibility of getting a vaccine.
Monica is asking if there's any specific data that relates to compassionate care to healthy patient outcomes during surgical recovery.
Oh boy, during surgical recovery, you know what, I'm going to have to say I'm not 100% sure about that specific situation. There is data showing that compassionate care has positive impacts on in general on patient outcomes, but in terms of surgical settings, I don't want to say that I know, because I don't, of specifically that setting, but I would guess that you are likely to find that it would. I would encourage you to consider looking at the Harvard Flourishing website, as well as, yeah, I think that would be the first place to go, to look there and see if there's some evidence. They have some pretty interesting studies done there.
Thank you. The next question comes from Jeffrey. He says, hi, Dr. Holman. You bring up the negative effects of toxic positivity, that no matter how difficult the situation, a person should have positive perspective. In an act of compassion, how do you suggest future nurses best practice empathy and acceptance rather than pathologizing emotion and strife?
So again, I'm going to come back to the importance of listening. If I understand the question, there was a part of it was about toxic positivity, which I'm not sure I understand about what that piece of it is, but instead of pathologizing people because they may take longer to cope with an event. I mean, there are many myths of coping, and my colleague Roxy Silver, my longstanding colleague Roxy Silver, is one of the most well-known, probably the most well-known academic intellectual who understands the myths of coping. And there are many myths, and it's really important for us to recognize them, and to, again, I come back to this issue of accepting and understanding that how people respond to different events varies widely, really widely. There are many, many people who could experience what you might perceive to be a very traumatic event, but they're kind of okay with getting through it. They've gotten through it. They're doing okay, and they're not showing a lot of distress. Instead of thinking that that person must be distressed and is hiding it and they're going to have pathological outcomes in a year, maybe we can say, wow, interesting. Let's help me understand what's holding you up. How are you coping with this that's making you do so well? So those are the kinds of things that I would encourage. Now, there is such a thing as toxic positivity, where you just tell somebody to think positive thoughts. That's not a good thing. I actually have a family member who passed away from AIDS many, many, many years ago. And one of his campaigns in life was to stop the effort at telling people who were diagnosed with AIDS in the late 80s and early 90s to have positive thoughts, because the positive thoughts would make them better. Just thinking positive thoughts isn't what makes you better. What makes you better is really having a connection with people who are showing you the love and respect and dignity that you deserve and are treating you really well. And fighting for that is a really important thing. Can positive thoughts be beneficial to us? Yeah, they can, but they're not gonna stop a virus like HIV. They're not gonna stop a virus, the decimation of one's immune system. They might be a small piece of a process that helps, but that's not the answer to healing. And it takes a village, it takes a community to help support people. And that's why we have a large healthcare profession, and we have nurses and doctors and respiratory therapists and all kinds of, physical therapists and nursing aides and all kinds of people in hospitals that help us, pharmacists, public health, everybody. And it takes that village to really help people heal. So anyway, I just wanted to say that about toxic positivity, because it's something that's kind of near and dear to my heart because of my cousin's experience.
Thank you for that. So many wonderful questions coming in. And I want to assure all of our guests today that you will get a link to this recording. We're going to reconnect with you all later on. So I know that there's been some questions. I think people want to share this important presentation further. Next question comes from Kelly. Thank you for speaking today. What advice would you give to healthcare providers facing compassion and COVID-19 fatigue as numbers decrease and restrictions lift? I find that many of my peers and I have struggled in the past months to accept that things are going to get somewhat better due to the vaccinations. How do we transition from a time of such distress back to normalcy, or whatever life is starting to look like past the COVID surge?
Really good question. The transition back to what we call normalcy, first of all, I don't think we're going to get back to what we call normal anytime soon. Not to say that we won't get back to something a little bit more resembling what we call normal. I think we might, but we're not going to get back to where we were in January 2020. Just life has changed for everybody. And in terms of transitioning back into a different life, I would say one of the most important things to do is to be really patient, really, really patient with ourselves and with each other, and to give people the benefit of the doubt, and to acknowledge and to share and talk about what are we experiencing? What am I experiencing as I'm transitioning back into having meetings with Addie in her office, or transitioning back into meeting with my colleagues in our big meeting room? What's that transition going to be like? And people might have fears about contracting the virus or a variant of the virus, so I think being very patient and respectful of ourselves and of each other, I would encourage people to think about engaging with, working slowly with people they are connected with, people they feel strongly about, who, or they feel close to use that bond to help slowly get themselves back into that normal setting. And also I would encourage nurses, I'm not sure if Kelly's a nurse, but if so, I would encourage nurses to work in teams, to work as a, find a partner, have a like a buddy, use a buddy system or something to help and check in with each other on a floor. If you're going back to work and you're not sure what it's going to be like. I think nurses who have been, if it's possible, I think nurses who have been put in, who have been working in an intensive ICU, COVID ICU type setting with multiple patients, I think those nurses should be given a break. Let them transition back into the workforce, give them a lighter load, I mean, that may mean everybody, but the more we treat people with respect and dignity and understand their need, the better off we're going to be, and the easier that transition is going to be for people. Now, how that's going to be achieved is a question, is a really good question, because if people are, if people are leaving the profession, then we may be stuck with not having enough staff. And so that means finding ways to address that. During the pandemic, what happened? We had medical students graduated early from medical school, nursing students graduated early from nursing school to start helping. Our nursing school, we had our students vaccinating people. Kudos go to my colleagues, the clinical health sciences colleagues, Leanne Burke and Susie Phillips and Tiffany Nielsen and all of my colleagues, Sarah Campbell and Sarah Brown and all of my colleagues in the clinical arena. They all were out there vaccinating people, and some of my other colleagues as well. And I think bringing the nurses into that process, having them help, the nursing students can help to supply the places where we need, we don't need to pull nurses out of a hospital setting to do the vaccinations. Let's have somebody else give them. So bring people out of retirement to start giving vaccinations. That's another option too.
Interesting. This is a statement that Martha shared. Martha says, I am a daughter of a nurse, a mother of a nurse, and a patient of nurses, and a patient health educator. Thank you so much for this presentation and references. Compassion is so important. The next question comes from Maria. She presents a statement and then follows with a question. And the statement is from Alexander of 2012. Collective traumas are reflections of neither individual suffering nor of actual events, but symbolic renderings that reconstruct and imagine them. Rather than descriptions of what is, they are arguments about what must have been and what should be. And then Maria goes on to ask the question, what is it that we are doing to reconstruct the trauma so we can draw meaning from it?
Interesting perspective. Dealing with the trauma, ways to pull meaning from the trauma. There are lots of ways that people bring meaning out of life's many challenges. Searching for meaning and finding meaning is a really important process that many people go through. Not everybody goes through it, but lots of people do start questioning and asking, why me? What does this mean for me? And reconstructing, it was interesting in her statement, she was talking about, I don't remember how she said it, but something about reconstructing it, like it was reconstructing the past and then looking at what it means for us as we go forward. And that's a really important, and that's to a certain degree, there are going to be very individual experiences of the same collective trauma, but there are also certain facts about certain events that are real. I mean, for example, there are people keeping track of how many people have died from the pandemic. Those are real numbers. Those aren't reconstructions. Those are facts. And so I think it's really important for us to recognize both the factual elements that surround a collective trauma, but also understand how those facts, how people are experiencing their response to those events, and be compassionate in how we work with them to help them bring meaning. And again, as I mentioned in my talk, one of the ways of bringing meaning to people's lives is to have them become active in your community in a way that helps to resolve the cause, the source of the problem. What can you do to help resolve the source of the problem? Whether it's institutionalized racism, whether it is whatever it may be. So those are the important things that I think we need to understand and move forward as we try to find meaning in what this experience has been for us.
Jessica is wanting you to speak a little bit more about the connection and distinction between empathy and compassion. For example, how do we cultivate compassion when our ability to empathize is diminished? How much is empathy a prerequisite for assessing and practicing compassion?
So empathy is a really important part of being able to connect with other people. It means I can feel I can feel what you're experiencing. Compassion takes you a step farther. It says, I can feel what you're experiencing, and I am motivated to do something to help you. That's how I distinguish empathy and compassion. Now, in terms of what to do when people are not experiencing empathy, they're feeling a lack of empathy for others. Oftentimes, and I don't mean to be too psyche about this. I've been called the psyche nurse so many times, it's amazing. But to deal with it from a psychological perspective, I would say, frankly, if one is struggling to feel empathy for someone else, then I would suggest that maybe there are some things in your own life that maybe you're struggling to give empathy to yourself for. And I would say, if you're struggling, if there are things, and that's not to say it's all you. That's not to say it's all you, because there are experiences in life that are, things that happen outside of us that cause us to feel, bad. And as I was saying, the moral injury that people have been experiencing as a result of COVID has everything to do with environments where there wasn't much empathy or compassion for the nurses. And so being able to recognize that if there is behavior being engaged, if people or institutions are behaving in ways that are lacking empathy toward you, never, ever forget that as an individual, you have the power in yourself to decide whether you're going to buy into their lack of empathy for you. Never give away your power, never give away your control, never give somebody that much power to hurt you. And so what I would say is, even though, and I'm saying this at an emotional level, obviously there are institutions that have power to hurt us. And, there's violence perpetrated by institutions of, for example, sometimes policing can cause violence, has caused violence in the Black community in particular. So understanding there are real sources of danger. I'm not saying that's don't give them power. They have power, but what you don't have to give them power over is how you think and how you address it. So it's kind of like decolonizing your mind so that you don't give them the power over you in terms of how you think about what's going on. And by not giving them the power over you, you get out there and you become engaged in the community and you say, I'm not going to buy into this. I'm going to take action and I'm going to try to stop what's going on that's wrong in my community. And by doing that, I'm showing empathy for myself and I'm showing empathy for the others in my community. And that's the healing. That is where healing can transpire. And I think I probably went way off on that question. Probably went off on a tangent, but I just want to share that I think that's a really important feature of rebuilding one's empathy for oneself. And maybe, again, connecting with somebody you feel close to who you can talk to about that, who you can get help from with that.
Thank you, Dr. Holman. And apologies, that question came from Jessie, not Jessica. So my apologies, Jessie, for that. And we are just about ready to close. There's a few more questions, but we can't get to everybody. And I just want to thank everyone for your input and your thoughts to share with Dr. Holman. And at this time, I'd like to turn it back over to our Dean, Dean Nemeth.
Well, Alison, this has been an incredible presentation. And I was just reading some of the comments that the audience has put out there: informed, inspiring, powerful. So kudos to you for being such a wonderful representative of our Sue and Bill Gross School of Nursing. So I want to thank you so much for that. I also want to thank the student Tyler Cohen for the award. Congratulations to you, and keep doing the wonderful thing that you're doing. Another thank you to Sharon Leider and her wonderful family for being here. Thank you to friends and attendees. This has been a very powerful lecture, and we've all learned so much from this. And I just want to say that it was so powerful to hear through the eyes of the nurses what they were experiencing. And thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing the tools that we can all use today to make a difference in this world and the people that we're around. So Dr. Holman, this has been wonderful, and I want to thank you for doing such a fabulous job.
Well, I want to say thank you to all of you who came to the team and participated and asked such wonderful questions. I really appreciate having the opportunity to share this with you. And again, special thanks to the Leider family, because you guys are the best.
Thank you, everyone. Be safe.
Congratulations, Taylor.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.